The Black Ledger, Episode 5, Game of Shadows. Rain hammered against the black tower windows. The observation chamber remained frozen in silence. Elias Mercer is alive. The words still hung in the air like smoke. The Parliament leader stood motionless beside the original Black Ledger. No visible panic, no visible anger, but Adrian noticed it immediately. The old man's right hand tightened slightly against the leather cover of the book. Tiny movement, tiny truth. Interesting, very interesting, because for the first time, the Parliament was reacting emotionally instead of structurally. The operator remained near the doorway, breathing hard. We intercepted emergency tunnel footage from Lower Manhattan. The Parliament leader's voice returned, calm again. "Show me!" The emergency screens shifted instantly. Static rolled across the observation chamber. Then grainy black and white tunnel footage appeared. Flooded maintenance corridors beneath Manhattan, broken pipes, collapsing concrete, and moving through the darkness. Elias, covered in dust, bleeding slightly from the forehead. Alive. The camera angle shook violently. Not surveillance infrastructure, handheld. Someone underground was filming him intentionally. The operator spoke nervously. "The footage is already spreading through civilian broadcasts." Of course it was. Memory multiplies faster than containment once systems fracture publicly. Adrian watched the footage carefully. Interesting movement pattern. Elias was not escaping randomly. He was heading somewhere specific. The Parliament leader noticed Adrian studying the tunnels. "You see it too?" Not a question. Adrian nodded once. "He's returning to the origin point." The older man's expression darkened slightly. "Yes." Thomas would have missed it. Harris probably too, but Adrian understood Elias now. Not just intellectually, structurally. People always return to the place that created them before final confrontation. The Parliament leader turned toward the city model slowly. He intends to open the lower archive. Silence. That sounded important, very important. Adrian lit another cigarette carefully. "What's in it?" The older man looked toward him and, for the first time, hesitated. Interesting, very interesting, because hesitation inside controlled men reveals genuine danger. Finally, he answered quietly, "The original selection records." The room suddenly felt colder. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "From 1958? No." Another pause. "From before." That changed everything. The blackout systems, the evacuation hierarchy, the underground architecture, none of it began with Manhattan. The Parliament leader walked slowly towards the black windows overlooking the city. It started during the war. Adrian followed carefully. "Which war?" The older man almost smiled faintly. That question became difficult after a while. Interesting answer, not poetic, historical, because systems like the Parliament evolve gradually through repeated crises, wars, famines, economic collapses, each catastrophe justifying stronger continuity structures. The older man continued quietly. Civilization learned an important lesson during the 20th century. Rain flashed silver across the windows. Governments collapse. A pause. But infrastructure survives. Adrian finally understood. The Parliament was never truly political. It was infrastructural. Banks, transit, power grids, emergency management, the hidden systems beneath nations themselves. The leader looked back toward the footage of Elias moving through the tunnels. The lower archive contains the first version of the ledger. Rachel's archive drive suddenly felt much smaller in Adrian's mind. "What's different about it?" The older man answered softly. It contains names that still matter. Silence. Then Adrian understood the real terror beneath the Parliament. Not the dead, the living, families, corporations, political dynasties, structures still active inside modern civilization. The original architects never disappeared. They inherited themselves. The operator interrupted nervously again. Crowds are gathering near eastern tunnel exits. The screen shifted. Hundreds of civilians now filled sections of lower Manhattan, watching rescue teams, watching survivors emerge from underground, watching history surface physically beneath the city. No panic anymore. Curiosity. And curiosity destabilizes hidden systems slowly but permanently. The Parliament leader studied the crowd silently, then quietly asked Adrian, "Do you know why civilizations create myths?" Adrian said nothing. The older man answered himself, "To simplify memory." The footage of Elias flickered again. He had reached a massive steel door deep beneath Manhattan, older than Citadel, older than the evacuation systems, ancient industrial architecture, and painted across the door. The divided circle symbol, but different, incomplete, like an earlier version of the mark. The Parliament leader whispered quietly, "He found it." Interesting, very interesting, not fear, regret. The old man moved toward the emergency controls quickly now. "Seal all lower sectors." The operator hesitated. "We already tried. The systems aren't responding." Another tiny fracture. The infrastructure itself rejecting centralized control. Adrian watched the footage closely, then noticed something strange. The people surrounding Elias underground were not survivors, not Parliament recovery teams either. Ordinary civilians, subway workers, transit engineers, people helping him navigate the lower tunnels. Interesting, human improvisation again, the one variable no system fully survives. The Parliament leader saw it too. His jaw tightened slightly. "Why are they helping him?" Adrian answered quietly. "Because they saw the city leave people below once already." Silence. The old man looked toward Manhattan through the glass tower, toward the streets filled with questions now, toward the crowds no longer obeying official narratives automatically, and for the first time, Adrian realized something important. The Parliament leader was not evil. That would have been simpler. He genuinely believed uncontrolled humanity eventually destroys civilization. And every historical catastrophe probably reinforced that belief repeatedly. But he forgot something essential. Humanity also rebuilds civilization every time it collapses, messily, imperfectly, but together. The emergency screens flickered violently again. Then the footage zoomed closer toward Elias underground. He placed his hand against the ancient steel door slowly and looked directly into the camera, not surprised it was there, waiting for it. Then he quietly said one sentence. "Tell Adrian the book was never about the dead." Static exploded across the screen. Then the feed died completely. Silence returned to the observation chamber. Adrian stared at the black monitor for several long seconds, then finally understood. The black ledger was not recording victims, it was recording inheritance. Who receives power after catastrophe? Who shapes the next structure afterward? And somewhere beneath Manhattan, Elias was about to expose the first names ever written inside it. The black monitor remained silent. Rain whispered against the glass tower high above Manhattan. No one inside the observation chamber moved immediately, because everyone understood now. The ledger was never a record of death. It was a record of succession. Selection? Inheritance? The Parliament leader stood motionless beside the original black book, for the first time since Adrian met him. The old man looked tired, not physically, historically, like someone carrying structures too old to collapse cleanly. Adrian stepped slowly toward the city model beneath glass, green sectors, red sectors, selection maps beneath Manhattan. All of it suddenly looked smaller now, smaller than the idea hidden underneath it. You weren't preserving civilization, Adrian said quietly. The Parliament leader answered without looking at him. No. A pause. We were preserving continuity between collapses. Interesting wording. Not peace, not order. Continuity. Meaning the Parliament never believed catastrophes could truly be prevented, only managed. Adrian looked toward the black ledger, and the names inside it. The older man finally turned toward him. They are the names of people who inherited responsibility after systems failed. Responsibility. Interesting choice of word, because responsibility sounds moral. Selection sounds mathematical. The Parliament always hid brutality inside civilized language. The operator near the door spoke nervously again. Crowds breached the eastern barricades. The emergency monitors activated automatically. Live footage from lower Manhattan flooded the room. Hundreds of civilians now filled the streets near the tunnel exits. Police officers no longer pushing them back. Some even helping direct underground survivors toward medical stations. The Parliament leader watched silently, then whispered almost to himself, "It's happening faster than expected." Adrian noticed that immediately. Interesting, very interesting. Not denial, adjustment. The Parliament leader still believed this instability could eventually reorganize into structure again. Because to men like him, all societies eventually centralize after fear spreads long enough. The old man walked slowly toward the towering black windows. Do you know why people accept hierarchy during catastrophe? Adrian remained silent. The leader answered anyway, because uncertainty exhausts them. A pause. Eventually, they beg for structure again. Adrian looked down toward the streets below. The crowds, the volunteers, the chaos. Messy, unstable, human. Maybe, Adrian admitted quietly, but they remember who abandoned them first. Silence. That sentence hit harder than argument, because memory changes how future structures are trusted. The Parliament leader knew that, which meant tonight mattered historically, even if the Parliament survived institutionally. Then one of the emergency frequencies exploded through the observation chamber speakers. Multiple civilians entering restricted transit sectors. Another voice interrupted. They're searching for hidden tunnels. The Parliament leader closed his eyes briefly. Interesting reaction, not fear, recognition. The underground system would never be invisible again, not after this. The operator swallowed nervously. Media stations are demanding official answers. The older man looked toward Adrian carefully. You think transparency improves civilization? No, Adrian answered softly. I think hidden systems eventually become unstable. Huge difference. Transparency creates chaos too, but hidden architecture creates inherited catastrophe. The Parliament leader studied him silently for several seconds, then unexpectedly asked, "What would you replace us with?" Interesting question, not rhetorical. Real. Adrian realized something disturbing in that moment. The old man genuinely wanted an answer. Not because he doubted the Parliament, because deep down he feared the alternative might actually be worse. Adrian walked slowly beside the giant city model. watching emergency routes pulse beneath Manhattan, watching the architecture built from fear. Finally, he answered quietly, "Nothing." The Parliament leader frowned slightly. Adrian continued, "That's the mistake." A pause. "You think civilization survives because someone controls it secretly." The rain intensified against the tower windows. But civilization survives because millions of people keep rebuilding it imperfectly. The old man shook his head slowly. Romantic thinking. No. Adrian looked toward the crowds below again. Observed thinking. Interesting silence followed, because neither man was completely wrong. That was the real danger. The Parliament existed because history repeatedly rewarded centralized continuity during collapse. But humanity also repeatedly survived through spontaneous cooperation. Both truths existed simultaneously. Then suddenly, every screen inside the observation chamber flickered violently. The city-wide emergency broadcast system activated again automatically. Static flooded the room, then Elias appeared live on every monitor, standing inside the lower archive beneath Manhattan. The ancient steel door behind him, now open. Rows of shelves disappeared endlessly into darkness. Thousands of black ledgers, not one, thousands. Thomas would have called it impossible. Adrian called it inevitable. Systems always archive themselves obsessively. Elias looked directly into the camera. Dust covered his face. Blood stained his collar, but his eyes looked calmer than before. Human. Finally, human. The Parliament called this continuity. He stepped slowly between the shelves. But continuity built on buried people becomes inheritance of fear. The cameras moved across the ledgers, dates spanning generations, wars, blackouts, economic collapses, civilian casualty thresholds, selection records, the hidden history of survival architecture. Elias stopped beside one shelf carefully, then removed a single ledger, smaller than the others, older. He opened it slowly, and for the first time, the city saw the original names: industrial families, political dynasties, transit financiers, media owners, people whose descendants still shaped modern Manhattan openly. The Parliament leader went completely still, no movement at all now. Interesting. Very interesting, because Adrian finally understood what truly terrified the structure. Not exposure of the tunnels, inheritance exposure. The realization that hidden power survives through bloodlines and institutional continuity. Elias looked back toward the camera. They never selected who survives. A pause. They selected who inherits the future afterward. Silence crushed the observation chamber. Then, outside the tower, the sound began. Crowds, thousands of voices rising from the streets below Manhattan, the city reacting in real time. The Parliament leader stared out through the glass slowly, watching the architecture above Manhattan become visible to the people below it. And for the first time, Adrian realized something astonishing. The old man had never imagined the city would see the structure and remain standing afterward, but Manhattan was still alive, still functioning, still adapting, imperfectly, humanly. Then Elias spoke one final sentence through the emergency broadcast, and everything changed. There is one final name left unwritten in the ledger. Static rolled softly across the monitors. Elias looked directly into the camera, directly at Adrian, then quietly said, "And it belongs to the man who decides what happens next." Silence filled the observation chamber. The final broadcast still echoed through the tower speakers. The man who decides what happens next. Adrian stared at Elias's frozen image on the monitor, dust-covered face, tired eyes. No performance left, only truth. Then the broadcast cut to static. Rain hammered against the black tower windows harder now, far below Manhattan. The streets were no longer quiet. Crowds gathered around police barricades, news vans blocked intersections. People pointed upward toward the black glass tower openly now. The Parliament was no longer invisible, and invisible systems rarely survive public attention unchanged. The Parliament leader remained motionless beside the original ledger, no visible emotion. But Adrian noticed something subtle. The old man had stopped watching the monitors. He was watching the streets. Interesting. Very interesting, because for the first time, the structure above Manhattan feared the people below it more than the chaos beneath the city. The operator near the doorway spoke again. "Sir, crowds are surrounding the building." Another pause. "Police units are refusing dispersal orders." The Parliament leader closed the ledger slowly, carefully, like a priest sealing scripture. Then he finally asked Adrian quietly, "Do you know why Elias failed?" Interesting question. Adrian lit another cigarette. He didn't. No. The old man stepped toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. He exposed the system. A pause. But exposure is not replacement. Silence. Because again, the statement was partially true. Destroying secrecy does not automatically create better structures. Adrian understood that. The terrifying thing about the Parliament was not that it existed. It was that history repeatedly creates systems like it naturally during collapse. The old man continued calmly. People panic. Another pause. Resources disappear. Emergency footage flashed across the monitors again. Traffic failures, hospital overcrowding, power instability, and eventually, the Parliament leader looked back toward Adrian. Someone must decide which systems survive. Adrian walked slowly toward the black windows, toward the city. Maybe, a pause. But maybe those decisions shouldn't belong to invisible men. The older man almost smiled sadly. "You still think visibility changes power?" "No." Adrian's eyes remained on Manhattan below. "I think visibility changes obedience." That sentence landed heavily inside the observation chamber, because obedience was the true foundation beneath the Parliament, not force, belief. The belief that hidden structures knew better than ordinary people. And tonight, that belief was fracturing publicly. Then suddenly, the tower lights flickered violently. A deep, mechanical sound echoed through the building beneath them. The Parliament leader turned instantly toward the emergency monitors. Interesting reaction. Real surprise this time. The operator looked terrified. "We lost lower stabilization systems." The black tower trembled slightly. Adrian understood immediately. The tower itself connected directly into the underground infrastructure below Manhattan, and the underground system was collapsing. The old man moved quickly toward the control console. "Activate secondary supports." The operator hesitated. "We can't." "Why?" Another pause, then quietly. "Because civilians already entered the maintenance sectors." Silence. Again, human unpredictability. The same force breaking every controlled structure tonight. The emergency monitors shifted automatically. Live footage from underground maintenance tunnels appeared. Transit workers, civilians, underground survivors, all working together manually beneath Manhattan, repairing support systems, stopping tunnel flooding, keeping parts of the city alive collectively. No Parliament coordination, no hidden hierarchy, improvised cooperation. The Parliament leader stared at the screens silently, then whispered, "They don't even understand what they're repairing." Adrian answered quietly. They understand people are trapped below. Huge difference. The old man looked toward him slowly, and for the first time, Adrian saw genuine uncertainty. Not tactical, existential, interesting, very interesting. Because now the Parliament leader faced the one reality his philosophy never fully solved. Human beings repeatedly help one another even without centralized structure. Not always, not perfectly, but enough to destabilize pure mathematical control. Then the emergency speakers crackled again. Another live transmission, but not Elias this time. Rachel. Her voice echoed through every monitor inside the observation chamber. If you're hearing this. Static rolled softly behind her. The archive drives are already spreading through independent networks. The Parliament leader's expression hardened instantly. Find her. But the operator looked pale. We can't track the transmissions. Of course not. Once information escapes centralized infrastructure, it behaves like people do. Messily, unpredictably, alive. Rachel's voice continued. The city deserves to know who built the selection systems. Names began appearing across the monitors. Banking families, political offices, transit authorities, media corporations, institutional inheritance exposed publicly. The Parliament was no longer abstract. It had faces now, history attached to living structures. The crowds outside the tower grew louder. Adrian could hear them even through the rain and glass. Not riots. Questions spreading upward through Manhattan. The Parliament leader finally sat slowly beside the city model, the first genuinely human movement Adrian had seen from him all night. Tired, heavy, and suddenly older. You think this ends the Parliament? Adrian looked toward the streets below. No. A pause. I think it forces it to exist publicly now. The old man said nothing because he knew Adrian was right. Secret systems survive through invisibility. Visible systems become accountable eventually. Not immediately, not perfectly, but eventually. Then the observation chamber doors burst open again. Another Parliament operative entered quickly. Sir, breathing hard, recovery teams lost contact with the lower archive sectors. The old man looked up slowly. And Elias Mercer? Silence. The operative swallowed. We don't know. Interesting, very interesting, because men like Elias rarely vanish accidentally, especially not inside systems they understand better than anyone alive. The Black Tower trembled again, this time harder, far below them. The city continued rebuilding itself imperfectly, and somewhere beneath Manhattan, the broker was still moving through the dark. The storm over Manhattan intensified. Lightning flashed across the skyline behind the black glass tower. For brief moments, the city looked fractured, half illuminated, half hidden, exactly like the truth beneath it. The observation chamber trembled again. Coffee rippled inside forgotten cups across the Parliament tables. The underground infrastructure below Manhattan was still unstable, and now the instability was reaching upward. The Parliament leader remained seated beside the city model, watching the emergency feed silently, not issuing commands anymore. Interesting, very interesting, because Adrian finally understood something important. The old man knew the structure could survive exposure, but he no longer knew if it deserved to. Huge difference. The operator near the doorway continued receiving frantic transmissions. Multiple archive leaks spreading nationally. State officials demanding confirmation. Financial systems refusing Parliament override requests. The structure was fragmenting. not collapsing, fragmenting, and fragmentation terrifies centralized systems more than destruction, because fragments evolve unpredictably. Adrian stood beside the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Below them, crowds still filled the streets, not panicked, alert, alive. Transit workers reopened subway entrances manually. Hospitals coordinated through volunteer radio networks. Restaurants distributed food freely to stranded civilians. The city was adapting horizontally instead of hierarchically. Messy, inefficient, human. The Parliament leader finally spoke quietly. "You think this proves people are good?" Adrian shook his head slowly. "No." A pause. "I think it proves people are complicated." The old man almost smiled faintly. "Complication kills civilizations eventually." "No," Adrian answered softly. "Certainty does." Silence, another dangerous silence, because deep down, both men knew history contained evidence for both arguments. Then suddenly, all emergency screens inside the observation chamber went black. Not static, dead. The operator looked terrified. "We lost external feeds completely." The black tower lights dimmed again. Emergency power only now. The Parliament's observation systems were going blind. Interesting, very interesting, because hidden structures survive through information superiority. And tonight, the city stopped behaving predictably enough to monitor cleanly. Then a new sound echoed through the tower. Footsteps, slow, measured, approaching the observation chamber from the dark hallway beyond. No one moved immediately. The Parliament operatives near the doors raised their weapons instinctively. The footsteps continued, calm, unhurried. And then Elias Mercer stepped into the room, alive, dust-covered, coat torn from the collapsing tunnels below Manhattan, but alive. Thomas would have called it impossible. Adrian called it inevitable. People built by underground systems rarely die in simple ways. The room froze completely. Even the Parliament leader remained silent for several seconds. Elias looked older now, not physically, truthfully, like a man who finally stopped carrying an ideology heavier than himself. The operatives aimed weapons toward him. He ignored them completely. His eyes remained fixed on the old man beside the city model. Then quietly he said, "You never understood the experiment." Interesting opening sentence, very interesting. The Parliament leader answered calmly, "We understood it better than anyone." "No." Elias stepped slowly toward the center of the observation chamber. "You believed abandonment creates monsters." Lightning flashed outside the black tower windows, but abandonment creates witnesses. Silence crushed the room, because that was the real difference between Elias and the Parliament. The Parliament saw survivors as instability risks. Elias saw them as memory carriers. The old man stood slowly. "You exposed the system." A pause. "And now what?" Elias looked toward Manhattan below. The crowds, the emergency lights, the imperfect city surviving without hidden guidance. Now they choose whether to build another one. Adrian finally understood. That was the true purpose of the ledger. Not prediction, not inheritance. Warning, every catastrophe gives birth to people who believe hidden control is necessary. Every generation recreates the temptation. The Parliament was not unique, it was historical gravity. The old man looked toward the original black ledger, resting on the table, then toward Elias. "You could have inherited continuity." Elias almost laughed softly. "I inherited fear." Another pause. "And I mistook it for truth." Interesting, very interesting, because now the broker was finally speaking honestly, not philosophically, humanly. The Parliament operatives remained frozen, waiting for orders, but the old man no longer looked interested in commands, only in understanding how the structure failed. Adrian noticed that immediately. Then Elias slowly approached the original ledger, the first ledger, the root of the architecture. The old man did not stop him. Interesting, extremely interesting. Elias placed his hand gently against the worn leather cover, then looked toward Adrian. The last name was never meant for me. Silence. Adrian stared at him carefully, then finally understood. The final unwritten name in the ledger was not about inheritance of power. It was about inheritance of responsibility. Who decides what humanity becomes after exposure? The Parliament leader spoke quietly. If you destroy the ledger, Elias interrupted softly, another one eventually appears. Correct. Structures like this regenerate naturally through fear and catastrophe. Destroying books changes nothing permanently. Changing memory does. Elias looked toward Adrian again, then asked the question no system could answer cleanly. What happens when the next blackout comes? No one spoke immediately. Rain hammered against the tower. The city breathed below them, imperfect, unstable, alive. Finally, Adrian answered quietly. The same thing that always happens. A pause. People fail each other. Another pause. And help each other. The observation chamber remained silent because that was the truth. None of them could fully organize into ideology. Humanity was both things simultaneously, always. Elias nodded slowly. Then he opened the original black ledger to the final empty page, blank, waiting. The Parliament leader watched silently. Adrian, too. The city itself almost seemed to pause beneath the storm. Elias picked up a fountain pen resting beside the ledger, then placed it gently into Adrian's hand and quietly said, "Now decide what gets remembered." The fountain pen felt heavier than it should have. Old metal, black lacquer, perfectly balanced. Adrian stood motionless beside the original ledger while rain battered the tower windows above Manhattan. The final page remained blank, waiting, not for a name, for a decision. The Parliament leader watched silently from across the observation chamber. No commands, no threats. Interesting, very interesting, because the structure had finally reached the one thing systems fear most: human choice without predictable outcome. Elias stepped away from the ledger slowly. Tired eyes, empty hands, for the first time since Adrian met him. The broker looked free of the role entirely, not redeemed, just honest. The black tower trembled softly again. Below Manhattan, sirens echoed through rain-filled streets. The city continued rebuilding itself imperfectly. People helping strangers, people exploiting confusion. Both truths existing simultaneously, exactly as they always had. The Parliament operatives near the doors remained frozen, weapons lowered slightly now, waiting. Everyone waiting, because somehow the final decision no longer belonged to the Parliament or Elias or even the city itself. It belonged to memory. Adrian looked down at the empty ledger page. Interesting structure. Every previous entry contained the same pattern. Crisis, selection, inheritance. The names were never chosen randomly. They belonged to people who shaped what survived afterward. And now the final page waited for the same thing. The Parliament leader finally spoke quietly. "You still don't understand what the ledger really is." Adrian said nothing. The old man continued, "It isn't a weapon." A pause. "It's a mirror. Lightning flashed across the black windows. The observation chamber illuminated white for half a second, enough for Adrian to see the city reflected across the glass behind them all. Thousands of lights, millions of lives, none fully controllable. The Parliament leader walked slowly toward the city model beneath the glass. Every catastrophe creates the same question. His hand moved across the emergency routes beneath Manhattan. Who decides what survives? Elias answered softly. That's the wrong question. The old man looked toward him. Then Elias continued. The real question is, who gets forgotten? Silence. Because buried people built the entire structure beneath Manhattan. Not merely fear. Forgetting. The Parliament buried survivors below the city, then buried the memory of them afterward. And Elias spent his life trying to force remembrance through catastrophe. Both systems shaped by the same wound. Adrian finally understood the terrible symmetry between them. The Parliament feared chaos so deeply it sacrificed humanity for continuity. Elias feared forgetting so deeply he sacrificed stability for memory. Both were right, and both were dangerous. The tower lights flickered again. The emergency generators were weakening. Outside, the crowd surrounding the black tower continued growing. News helicopters circled overhead. The city was watching now, not fully understanding, but watching. The Parliament leader looked toward Adrian carefully. If you expose everything completely, a pause. The city fractures. Elias answered immediately. If you hide everything, another pause. The city repeats itself blindly. Again, two truths, both real. The final page of the ledger remained blank between them. Adrian stared at it silently, then finally asked the question no one else had. Who wrote the first name? Interesting reaction. The Parliament leader smiled faintly. Sadness this time, not superiority. Someone terrified. That answer changed everything, because suddenly the Parliament no longer looked like evil architects. It looked like frightened survivors who institutionalized fear across generations. Exactly how systems like this are always born, not through cruelty first, through panic, then structure, then justification, then inheritance. Adrian closed the ledger slowly. The old man watched carefully. So, Adrian looked toward Manhattan below, the city helping itself survive without certainty, imperfectly. No clean ideology, no perfect structure, only people trying repeatedly. Then, he finally spoke. The problem isn't the ledger. Silence. The problem is believing any group should hold it permanently. Interesting. Very interesting, because that answer rejected both the Parliament and Elias simultaneously. The old man studied Adrian carefully. You think decentralization survives catastrophe? No. Adrian lit another cigarette. I think concentration guarantees corruption eventually. The Parliament operatives exchanged uncertain looks. Even they understood the implication. The structure above Manhattan had already begun cracking internally. The city had seen too much. Too many witnesses now, too many broadcasts, too many questions. Elias stepped beside the windows overlooking Manhattan. You know they'll rebuild something. Yes, Adrian answered quietly. Human beings always do. Another pause, but maybe next time they build it publicly. The rain softened outside gradually, dawn beginning somewhere behind the clouds. The Parliament leader looked older now, not defeated, human, which somehow felt stranger. Then he quietly asked Adrian, "What would you write on the final page?" Silence spread across the observation chamber. The city waited below them. The tower waited. History itself almost seemed to pause. Adrian opened the ledger one last time. The empty page stared back at him, then slowly he began writing. Not a name, a sentence. The Parliament leader leaned closer slightly, Elias too. Adrian finished writing carefully, then turned the ledger toward them. On the final page, beneath decades of selection records, only 7 words appeared. No one should inherit the right to choose. Silence. Long, heavy, real. The Parliament leader stared at the sentence without moving. Then finally, he laughed quietly. Not mockingly, almost with relief. Interesting. Very interesting. Because maybe, deep down, he had been waiting decades for someone to reject the ledger completely. The Black Tower trembled again, harder this time. Structural alarms echoed through the observation chamber. The underground collapse beneath Manhattan was reaching upward. The operator near the door shouted, "Support systems are failing!" Elias looked toward the city one final time. The towers connected to the underground foundations. Adrian understood immediately. The entire structure was collapsing together, above and below Manhattan simultaneously. Fitting. Very fitting. The Parliament leader closed the ledger gently, then looked toward Adrian. What happens now? Adrian stared through the rain-covered windows at New York below. People moving, helping, arguing, surviving. Human. Then quietly answered, "Now the city remembers." The tower alarm screamed through the observation chamber. Deep mechanical warnings echoed inside the black glass structure above Manhattan. Support systems failing, foundation instability, evacuation protocols activating automatically. Interesting. Even the Parliament built escape routes for itself eventually. The city model beneath glass flickered weakly as emergency power failed, section by section. For the first time in decades, the architecture above Manhattan looked fragile, human. The Parliament operatives moved uncertainly near the exits. No one fully obeying structure anymore, no one fully abandoning it either. Exactly the state civilizations enter before transformation. Adrian stood beside the windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain slowed gradually outside, dawn pushing weak silver light across the skyline. The city below still moved, traffic restarting, subways reopening, civilians guiding civilians through flooded intersections. New York surviving the way it always had, messily. The Parliament leader remained near the ledger silently, reading Adrian's sentence again. No one should inherit the right to choose. Interesting expression now, not defeat, recognition. Like a man who spent decades carrying an impossible burden, finally seeing someone refuse it openly. Elias stepped beside Adrian quietly. "You know it won't last." Adrian lit another cigarette. "What won't?" "This." Elias looked toward Manhattan. The questioning, the awareness. A pause. People get tired. Yes, true. Humans forget gradually because memory is exhausting. Adrian understood that better than most, but forgetting completely. That was harder now. The city saw the tunnels, Adrian said quietly. It saw the survivors. Another pause. And it saw the people who built the structure. Elias nodded slowly. Yes. Not optimism. Acknowledgement. The difference mattered. The Parliament leader suddenly spoke behind them. "Civilizations do not collapse because of evil men." Adrian turned, slightly. The old man looked toward the black ledger, resting on the table. They collapse because frightened people surrender difficult choices to hidden systems. Interesting. Very interesting, because now the Parliament leader sounded less like an architect of control and more like a historian of failure. The tower shook violently again. Glass cracked across several observation windows. Emergency lights flashed blood red through the chamber. The operator shouted over the alarms, structural integrity dropping rapidly. The Black Tower was dying. Not metaphorically, literally. The underground collapse beneath Manhattan was pulling the foundations downward, architecture consuming itself, fitting end for a system built beneath buried people. Harris burst into the observation chamber then, covered in dust, breathing hard. Streets below are filling with civilians. He looked toward Adrian. They're watching the tower. Of course they were. The city always watches symbols collapse. That's how memory begins. Rachel entered behind him, clutching the archive drives tightly. The files spread nationally. A pause. International stations picked them up too. Interesting, very interesting. The Parliament no longer faced local exposure. Now it faced permanence. Information escaping geography entirely. The old man absorbed this silently, then quietly asked Rachel, how much survived? All of it. Silence. The Parliament leader nodded once. No anger, no panic, just inevitability finally accepted. Elias looked toward him carefully. You could still leave. The old man almost smiled faintly. No. A pause. I stayed alive long enough to watch the architecture fail honestly. Interesting answer, because maybe, deep down, he had grown tired of carrying continuity too. The alarms intensified again. Concrete cracked overhead. A section of the ceiling collapsed near the city model. Glass shattered across Manhattan's miniature streets. The symbolic city literally breaking apart beneath them. Adrian stared at it quietly, then finally understood the last deduction. The Parliament was never truly a conspiracy. It was fear organized into infrastructure, and fear always rebuilds itself eventually unless people remember why it formed in the first place. The old man stepped toward the windows overlooking dawn. The next crisis will come. Adrian nodded once. Yes, and someone will always try to build another parliament. Probably. Another pause, but maybe next time. Adrian looked toward the crowds gathering below the tower. People will recognize it sooner. Silence spread softly across the observation chamber. Not hostile anymore, human. Outside, the storm finally began breaking apart above Manhattan. Clouds splitting slowly over the skyline, morning light touching the city again. Then suddenly, the tower lurched violently sideways. Everyone grabbed for support instinctively. The lower foundations were collapsing completely now. The operator shouted desperately, "We have minutes!" Harris looked toward the emergency stairwell. "We move now!" Rachel grabbed the archive drives tighter. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind them, pale with fear. "The streets are chaos." "No," Adrian answered quietly. "The streets are awake." Huge difference. The Parliament leader picked up the black ledger slowly, then walked toward Adrian. For one strange second, the old man looked almost ordinary. Not myth, not system. Just an exhausted human being standing at the end of a structure too large for anyone to hold permanently. He handed the ledger to Adrian carefully. "You keep it." Adrian frowned slightly. "Why?" The old man looked toward the sentence on the final page, then answered softly, "Because you're the first man who understood it should never belong to anyone." Interesting. Very interesting. Elias watched silently beside the windows. No argument, no disagreement, only acceptance. Then the tower groaned again, louder now. Steel tearing somewhere deep below. The building was coming down. Harris moved toward the stairwell. Now! The group finally turned toward the exits, but Adrian paused one last time beside the shattered windows overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beneath dawn light, wounded, confused, alive. People filling the streets below, helping each other, fighting, arguing, surviving, human beings refusing to become one thing completely. And maybe that was the only reason civilization deserved another chance every time it broke. Adrian tucked the black ledger beneath his coat, then followed the others toward the collapsing stairwell. Behind them, the observation chamber windows finally shattered completely, and the Black Tower began to fall over Manhattan. The Black Tower fell slowly, too slowly, like a dying giant refusing to believe gravity had finally reached it. Steel screamed across Manhattan, glass exploded outward in glittering waves. People in the streets below stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped speaking, watching the structure above the city begin collapsing into itself. Adrian descended the emergency stairwell with the ledger pressed beneath his coat. Dust filled the air. Emergency lights flickered violently along the concrete walls. The building shook beneath every step. Rachel stayed close behind him, carrying the archive drives. Harris forced Thomas downward ahead of them. And Elias. Elias remained strangely calm. Interesting, very interesting, because men who survive buried systems eventually stop fearing collapse itself. The stairwell trembled again. A violent crack split through the walls above them. Concrete rained downward. The Parliament operatives descended alongside them now. No weapons raised anymore, no hierarchy visible. Just human beings trying to survive the same disaster equally. Fitting. Very fitting. The Parliament leader moved slower than the others, age finally visible in his posture, but his eyes remained fixed ahead, not upward, not backward, forward, as if he still believed structure mattered even inside collapse. Then suddenly, the emergency stairwell lights failed completely. Darkness swallowed everyone. Only distant red warning lamps glowed somewhere below. Thomas panicked instantly. "We're trapped!" "No," Adrian answered calmly. "We're descending." Huge difference. Panic always mistakes movement for imprisonment. The building groaned again, somewhere outside. Part of the tower finally collapsed into the surrounding streets. The sound rolled through Manhattan like thunder. Screams echoed faintly below. Car alarms exploded across the city. But then something unexpected happened. The emergency radios crackled alive again. Civilian frequencies. "Clear the avenue. Help, move people east. There are civilians trapped near the south entrance." No centralized command. No Parliament instructions. The city organizing itself spontaneously again. Messy. Human. Alive. Elias listened silently in the darkness, then quietly said, "They're adapting faster than the models predicted." The Parliament leader answered softly from somewhere lower on the stairs. "They always do initially." Interesting response, even now. He still viewed humanity through structural phases: adaptation, exhaustion, centralization, the cycle. Adrian understood his thinking perfectly now, and that was the dangerous part, because history repeatedly proved the old man partially correct. People do surrender freedom during prolonged fear. Systems do rebuild themselves after collapse. The real question was whether memory could interrupt the cycle long enough to matter. The stairwell shook violently again. A massive section above them collapsed entirely. Dust blasted downward like smoke. Rachel nearly fell. Adrian caught her arm instantly. The archive drive slammed against the concrete wall, still intact. Memory surviving by inches now. They continued downward blindly through the collapsing tower. Then suddenly, daylight appeared below them, street level. The main lobby had partially collapsed inward already. Black marble shattered across the floor, the giant glass city model destroyed beneath rubble. Manhattan broken symbolically at the center, fitting again. Outside, the streets looked unreal. Crowds filled the avenues. Emergency vehicles blocked intersections. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the collapse live across the world. And everywhere, people looked upward, not at the tower anymore, at each other, talking, arguing, helping strangers move away from falling debris. The city surviving collectively before any authority fully reorganized around it. Adrian stepped out into the rain-soaked street carefully. The black tower behind them leaned dangerously across the skyline, steel twisting, glass raining downward endlessly. The Parliament leader emerged beside him slowly. People nearby recognized him immediately from the broadcasts. Interesting. Very interesting. The Invisible Man had become visible publicly. Some civilians shouted angrily. Others simply stared. No one attacked him. No one protected him either. For the first time in decades, the Parliament existed without secrecy. And without secrecy, power changes shape quickly. Rachel looked around nervously. What now? No one answered immediately, because the answer no longer belonged to any single structure. The police had lost centralized control hours ago. The Parliament was exposed. The underground systems were collapsing. And yet, Manhattan was still alive. That mattered. Then the Parliament leader looked toward Adrian one final time. You believe the city learned something tonight? Adrian watched civilians pulling injured people away from debris nearby. I think the city remembered something tonight. The old man nodded slowly. Rain slid down his face unnoticed, and memory fades. Yes, another pause, but it leaves scars. Silence. Then suddenly, the tower began collapsing fully. The upper structure folded inward violently. Steel snapped across the skyline. The crowd screamed and ran. Dust exploded through the streets. Adrian grabbed Rachel and forced her behind an overturned emergency vehicle. Harris pulled Thomas downward, beside them. The Parliament leader remained standing for half a second too long, watching the tower fall, watching the architecture he spent decades preserving finally destroy itself publicly. Interesting final expression, not regret. Recognition. Then Elias moved suddenly. He grabbed the old man and pulled him backward just as the outer glass facade crashed into the avenue beside them. Concrete exploded across the street. Darkness swallowed everything. Noise, dust, steel, then silence. For several seconds, Manhattan disappeared inside grey smoke. The city stopped existing visually. Only sirens and distant voices remained. Then slowly, the dust began clearing. The black tower was gone, collapsed into its own foundations. The structure above Manhattan had buried itself exactly like the structures below it. Fitting ending. Very fitting. Adrian stood slowly through the smoke. People everywhere. Injured civilians, emergency workers, ordinary strangers helping each other through the rubble. No Parliament coordination, no hidden architecture directing movement, just humanity improvising survival again. Elias stood nearby beside the Parliament leader, both covered in dust, both suddenly looking equally human. Not symbols anymore, not systems, just survivors. The old man stared at the ruins silently, then quietly asked Adrian one final question. What happens now? Adrian looked across Manhattan, the wounded city breathing through smoke and rain, then toward the black ledger beneath his coat. Finally, he answered, "Now." A pause. "We see who tries to rebuild the shadows." Smoke drifted across Manhattan like fog over ruins. The Black Tower was gone. Only twisted steel and shattered glass remained where the Parliament once watched the city from above. Rain mixed with ash in the streets. Sirens echoed endlessly between buildings. And yet, New York was alive. That was the strange thing about cities. They survive people who believe they own them. Adrian stood near the wreckage with the black ledger hidden beneath his coat. Around him, civilians and emergency workers moved through debris together. No perfect order, no complete chaos. Human movement, messy, instinctive, real. The Parliament leader sat silently beside a destroyed ambulance. Dust covered his perfect suit now. For the first time, he looked exactly like everyone else. A survivor. Nothing more. Elias stood nearby, watching the crowds carefully, not studying them anymore, just watching. The difference mattered. Rachel moved through the street, helping paramedics organize survivors from the collapsed transit tunnels. Thomas handed out water bottles from overturned emergency crates. Harris coordinated traffic with exhausted police officers who no longer cared about hierarchy tonight. The city had flattened everyone temporarily. Interesting. Very interesting. Because catastrophe does that before systems rebuild themselves again. Dawn slowly broke across Manhattan. Real sunlight finally cutting through the storm clouds. The first clear light the city had seen since the blackout began. People stopped occasionally to stare at the ruins of the Black Tower. Some took photographs, some cried. Most simply watched silently, trying to understand what had existed above and below their lives without their knowledge. Memory beginning. Adrian lit a cigarette with trembling hands, not from fear, from exhaustion. The Parliament leader looked toward him quietly. "You think this changes history?" Adrian exhaled smoke into the cold morning air. "No." A pause. "I think this interrupts it." Interesting answer. The old man nodded slowly, because deep down, he understood the difference too. Humanity never escapes fear permanently, never escapes the temptation of hidden control. But interruption matters. Memory matters. The old man looked toward the ruined tower. Another structure will emerge eventually. Yes. Adrian watched civilians helping strangers through the wreckage. Probably. Another pause. But maybe next time people notice the foundations sooner. Silence settled between them. Not hostile anymore, just honest. Then Elias stepped closer, slowly. The morning light made him look older than ever. Not the broker, not the survivor beneath Manhattan, just Elias Mercer, a man who spent his life confusing memory with revenge. He looked toward Adrian carefully. "What are you going to do with the ledger?" Interesting question, because the answer mattered historically now. The Black Ledger was no longer just evidence, it was temptation. Every system eventually believes it can manage catastrophe more intelligently than ordinary people. That belief never dies completely. Adrian removed the ledger slowly from beneath his coat, ancient black leather, rainwater sliding across its surface, the final sentence still waiting inside. No one should inherit the right to choose. He stared at the book for several long seconds, then handed it to Elias. The former broker looked confused. "You trust me with this?" "No." Adrian almost smiled faintly. I trust you to understand why nobody should keep it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because true responsibility sometimes means refusing ownership entirely. Elias looked down at the ledger silently, then toward the ruins of Manhattan around them. Finally he nodded, understanding. Real understanding this time, without ideology, without structure, human. The Parliament leader watched quietly, then unexpectedly spoke. The city will demand answers. Harris laughed tiredly nearby. The city's been demanding answers for hours. No, the old man said softly. It will demand certainty. That sentence lingered heavily in the morning air, because certainty is comforting after catastrophe, and comfort always rebuilds structures eventually. Adrian understood that. Maybe the Parliament would die here, maybe it would survive under another name somewhere else. Maybe another generation would create a new version during the next crisis. History repeats because fear repeats. But now, Manhattan had witnesses. The underground survivors existed publicly. The archives existed publicly. The city had seen the architecture once, and once seen, hidden systems never fully disappear back into darkness again. A news helicopter passed slowly overhead, broadcasting the ruins live worldwide, the city watching itself change in real time. Rachel approached Adrian quietly. The files are everywhere now. Adrian nodded once. Good. People are already arguing online. About what? She looked toward the crowds. About whether the Parliament was necessary. Interesting, very interesting, because that was the real beginning, not collapse debate. Humanity arguing endlessly about freedom and security again, exactly as it always had. Thomas walked over, holding a newspaper soaked by rain, fresh emergency edition already printed, fast. Systems rebuild narrative quickly. He handed it silently to Adrian. Front page headline, Secret Infrastructure Network Exposed After Manhattan Blackout. Beneath it, a photograph. Not the tower, not the Parliament leader, not Elias. Ordinary civilians helping underground survivors out of subway tunnels. Interesting choice, very interesting choice. Maybe the city had already decided what mattered most. Adrian folded the newspaper carefully, then looked across Manhattan one final time. The wounded skyline, the smoke, the sirens, the people, alive, always alive somehow. The Parliament leader slowly stood from the rubble. No guards remained around him now, no hidden authority. Just an old man beneath morning light. He looked toward Adrian quietly. What happens to men like me? Adrian stared at the ruins of the Black Tower, then answered honestly, History studies you. A pause. And hopefully remembers you correctly. The old man nodded slowly, almost grateful. Then police vehicles finally arrived through the smoke-filled avenues. Real police this time, not Parliament recovery teams. Officers stepping carefully through the ruins without understanding yet what world they had entered. Elias looked toward Adrian one last time. What about us? Adrian lit another cigarette. The morning sun finally touched Manhattan fully behind him, then quietly answered, We become stories. And somewhere beneath New York, far below the collapsed tunnels and buried archives, the city continued breathing. Imperfect, unpredictable, human, exactly as it always would. End.